teaching of this book from the apostle of Jesus, we recall that he has, in the previous passage that we talked about last week, reminded us of how precious and valuable we are in God's eyes. But as we begin our text today, we see some of the struggles that they are facing. We're going to read 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 11, and go down through verse 25. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins on his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So, as he begins this, he starts by talking in verse 11 about these elect exiles as sojourners and exiles, because they had moved far from their homes. They had moved to a different area, different culture. Society was going to be different. I can't even imagine what it's like, the kind of shock that the Jewish Christians would have had moving up into that area of northern Turkey as we see it today. What a change that must have been for them as they moved to that place. They're far from home in a place that's very different from home. And that's very much a struggle. Are we, in some ways, also sojourners and exiles? There's a sense in which we too are not, should not be, fitting in with the things of this world and the people of this world, that we have a different life. So clearly, I think there are instructions for us here as we look at this passage. Peter speaks of two things that are opposed to us and one who is our example. So one of the things that is opposed to us in verse 11 is our flesh. But also in verse 12, my translation uses the word Gentiles, but I don't think he's making the point here of Jew versus Gentile. I think he's making the point here of those who are unbelievers, those who don't follow Jesus at this point. So we have both ourselves and those who don't follow after Jesus as part of the struggle with being sojourners and exiles. But we also have the example of Christ that he mentions at the end of this. And again, it's not hard for us to also see that Jesus was a sojourner and exile in this world, even among his own people. We're reminded in other passages that Jesus was tempted like we are, yet he did it without sin. He was surrounded by those who considered him an evildoer. As surprising as that sounds to us, but not everyone approved of him. And yet, Jesus did good. He submitted himself to God's will and eventually saved us because of that. In verse 15 of our text, he begins that section by the phrase, "For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." I'm going to kind of pluck that out, and I know I'm doing it, okay? But I'm going to apply it broader than just that sentence. It reminds us that Peter, as he writes to us, is not just like randomly giving us his opinion about how we are to live and how we are to survive as sojourners and exiles. The key for our understanding of this passage is that we understand what God's will is for us, and that his will for us is aligned with his eternal plan, which is the salvation of all those who are lost, the salvation of humankind. So this is the will of God. This is a reminder as we look at all of these things that it fits in with what and who God wants us to be. So the first thing that he mentions that we have to do, there's going to be 5 things in this passage that I see, the 5 instructions. The first aspect is one that's very inner. That is that we abstain from the passions of the flesh. What are these passions of the flesh? How many of your minds went immediately to Galatians 5:19 through 21? The works of the flesh are evident. That's how Paul begins that passage. They're evident. We all know these things. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like those. And he says if you participate in those things, you have no part in the kingdom of heaven. There's a part of us that a lot of times when we read that list, we start off very enthusiastically, the sexual immorality and the impurity, and we're like, yeah, that's really, really bad. But by the time we get to fits of anger, it's like, it happens sometimes. Abstain from the passions of the flesh, right? And that's all of them. He's not saying these are worse than the others. Be careful about the jealousy, the rivalries, those kind of things. As you look at the end of that passage in Galatians 5, after he talks about listing those works of the flesh, you recall that he said that those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. We've put it to death. So we abstain. We're keeping away from it. Now, Peter tells us specifically why we need to abstain from these things. He says, they wage war on your soul. Paul, again, captures that struggle for us in Romans, the 7th chapter. You remember that passage where he says, I find this to be a law within me. When I want to do good, evil lies close at hand. I delight in the law in my inner being, but I see in my members the law waging war against the law of my mind. And we all understand that struggle Paul felt, don't we? That there's a part of me, yes, I want to do good and I want to do right. And there's this other part of me that says, I'm going to kind of do what I want to do anyway. And it's a constant battle. Peter puts it in very stark terms in this passage when he says, it wages war against your soul. This is not just about being nice. This is a battle that you're in. You're fighting for your soul. And everything that Jesus has done for you and God has done for you, you still have choices to make in this battle. You still have to make that choice. I'm going to abstain from the passions of the flesh. The second thing that he mentions in this passage is to have your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, among those who are unbelievers. Honorable, that is being used in this passage, means something that is suited to its purpose. Some places it's translated beautiful or good. So the idea is that this is your conduct needs to be of such an orderly way, an excellent behavior among the Gentiles, that everybody can see it, that by correct teaching, by making the right choices and having the right attitudes, that people know you follow after Jesus and after the words that he has taught. So we need to have this honorable conduct. That word is used again in verse 12 when it says, when they see your good deeds, honorable deeds, good deeds that we're following after. Why does our behavior among those who are not us, why does that matter? We can't control everything that other people think about us. It does remind us we're constantly being scrutinized. But Peter warns us that people might accuse us of actually being evildoers. Can your conduct be misconstrued as being an evildoer? It happened to Jesus. They said he spent time with gluttons and drunkards. He was accused of rebelling against Rome. Paul cast out a demon of a little girl and went to jail. Paul was at the center of a riot in Ephesus. It happens that people are watching our conduct, and not just watching it, but sometimes maligning us about how we live and how we choose to behave. Now, it's important to understand, of course, we're not judged by them. We're judged by the Lord, just like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 4, where he made the point, I'm not aware of anything against myself, he said, but that's not how I'm acquitted. It's the Lord who judges me. So, yeah, we're going to have people who look at us and they're looking for opportunities to say, you're not what you should be. You're not what you claim to be. And they have set up their own standards of what that is or is not, and they often will accuse us of being evildoers. So why do we have to be mindful of this? Peter tells us that by having this honorable, by having this excellent conduct among the world, they're going to see our good deeds, and one day they'll glorify God in that judgment. Sometimes that can feel a long ways off, doesn't it? They may not recognize the good now, but they will. But certainly it's hard for us not to see in this Peter echoing the words of Jesus when he said in Matthew the 5th chapter that you are the light of the world. And what does he remind us about being lights of the world? Let your light shine. Don't hide it. Let your light shine so that when they see your good works, they glorify God. We're not in it for us. And that fits with God's plan, doesn't it? We need to choose to have honorable conduct so that people turn to God. So let's be excellent as we go out and do that. Our conduct out in the world matters. Even when they're deriding us, we're the light. That's what we need to do. The third thing he talks about is doing good. And actually the context of this has a lot to do with doing good in the sense of being subject to institutions. This is a different word for good than the word honorable that we were just looking at. This means doing good in a way that benefits others. So this is good not in the sense of I'm trying to do my very best and am excellent. This is I'm looking out for what I can do that helps you. I'm trying to do what's right. How can I profit you? And in that sense. And I think Peter has a very specific example of that doing good when he speaks of being subject to all the human institutions, all the governments, whether the emperor or the governors. So I'm going to go with kind of a stereotype here. You know it, I know it. Stereotypes are dangerous, right? For sojourners and exiles, when they come to a different place, how do the natives tend to look at sojourners and exiles? Generally, we're kind of suspicious, right? We keep an eye on them. We wonder if, why did they leave and what is their plan? Why are they here? Are they going to... We understand all those things. The idea of a stranger and a sojourner, an exile, going out and being in a different place. Peter says one of the ways that you can do good is to be subject to the government. That there's something good about that. And here's the thing, we're Americans and we struggle with that. We think not of subjecting ourselves to our government, but we have rights. And we are governed by the people, right? And so this is a hard instruction for us. And sometimes part of that is because the government seems to break their own rules or principles as they want to. I can't even imagine what it was like being under the Roman government, where it was so capricious. Also, we're allowed to disagree in our country, aren't we? I get to say that I don't agree. Peter reminds us here, as sojourners and exiles, doing good means submitting to the control of the government. And he says it's for the Lord's sake. Did you notice that? Subject yourself to them for the Lord's sake. It's not for my sake. It's not for freedom's sake. It's not for patriotism's sake. This is about Jesus. I think we miss that point sometimes. I remember all the time when I was growing up, I heard people say, you have to obey the government. You have to obey the government. They're not wrong, but they never explained why. It's for the Lord's sake. When Jesus was being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, what was it that Peter did to those people who came out to arrest him? Slice the ear. Either a brilliant chop or a horrible miss. Close call, maybe not a miss. It wasn't a miss. What was Jesus' reply to that? Put your sword away. Don't you think I can appeal to my Father? And he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels. He submitted. Did Jesus, when he do that, did he submit for the Lord's sake? It wasn't right what was happening. And I don't think it was easy. It wasn't easy for Peter. But he did it. And then, as that night goes on, what do we know about Jesus? He's silent before his accusers. He submits even to Pilate. He talks to them. He submits himself. What a great example for us. By doing this good, Peter says, we've silenced the ignorance of foolish people. There's a part of me that says that's a very easy part of us, that we like to hear that the people who are hurting us or defaming us, they're just foolish people. But it does say ignorance. This is, I think, the evil that they speak against us, the reasons that they might want to throw us in jail. They're ignorant because they don't understand. They're foolish because they don't try to understand what exactly is happening in these things. When Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you a king?" what did he do? You say, "I'm a king." Do you think that made sense to Pilate? Yes, you're a king, but not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. It's different. Pilate, Roman citizen, I don't know what he made of that. It's the will of God that we be actively doing good. And surprisingly to us, Peter in this passage makes the point that that means subjecting ourselves to others, working for their benefit, not always putting myself forward, not always putting my rights forward. I'm going to actively do good by submitting to the government. And that's what Jesus did. Which is interesting that his next point is that we need to live as people who are free. It's interesting. Right after he says, submit to the government, he says, live as free people. And this is certainly an attitude that we need to develop that helps us look at a world that opposes us, puts us in difficult trials and situations. And this is how I'm going to face the world, is I am a free person. It's hard to remember that, isn't it? Remember what Jesus said to the Jews in John the 8th chapter. Everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Well, he's dealt with that, hasn't he? Abstain from those things. We've been free from those. Those have been crucified. The slave doesn't remain in the house forever, but the son remains forever. So in fact, when we move from being in sin to being in Christ, we're sons. So if the Son sets you free, Jesus said, you'll be free indeed. Live as free people. Galatians 5 verse 1. Paul said, for freedom has Christ set us free. I love that verse so much because I think we don't focus on that. He set you free. He goes on to say, stand firm therefore and don't submit again to the yoke of slavery. Mostly talking, I think, about sin. But later he'll make reference back to that in the 5th chapter and beginning in verse 13. For you were called to freedom, brothers. You've been set free. You've been called to this freedom. And then he says, only don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love, what's the rest of it? Serve one another. Do you see the tension between those two ideas? I'm free. I'm free to serve. Live as free people. So it doesn't mean that we can do evil. I mean, he's already talked about that, right? Honorable conduct and abstaining. Nor that we can hide behind our freedom and do things that are sinful. That includes not submitting to authorities. The book of Galatians that we just talked about talks about not using our freedom as an opportunity for the flesh or going back to that yoke of slavery. Now, he gives 4 really short instructions about living as free people. The first one, honor everyone. The word honor has the idea of value. Understanding that each human on this earth has value. And I say that, and all of us are probably, yes, we agree, every human has value. But the truth is, we tend to assign value based on our standards of what is good and worthy and righteous. And a lot of times those standards follow the standards of the world that really have to do with wealth and social status and job and cleanliness. And just to pull something out of a big thing right now, how do you think of the immigrants who are coming to this country? Do you value them? This passage says, honor everyone. I know, there's a part of me in my mind that goes, so I'm supposed to honor Hitler? He was a bad guy. He didn't say honor everyone, but Nero, who was their bad guy in a government. They had a lot of bad rulers. He didn't say, except for the bad ones. I'm not saying this is easy, but he does say honor everyone. This is not a matter of judging if you think that their actions are right or wrong. That misses the point. Free people honor everyone. The second one, he says, love the brotherhood. Do what's right, help each other. We need to build each other up. If you're a sojourner and an exile, one of the things that we can do as a free people is learn to love each other better. Paul in Galatians says, through love, serve one another. Fear God is the next one he makes the point of. Live as free people, fear God. I think of Peter standing before the Sanhedrin. Peter and the apostles say we must obey God rather than men. And then he repeats again for us, the fourth one, honor the emperor. Not just subject yourself to the emperor, but honor the emperor. Value those who lead us. Again, I don't think that means that we have to think they're always right or moral. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them, but we are to submit to them. Live as free people. Oh, the last one's really the hardest of all the ones that we're talking about, where he's dealing with enduring suffering. And this part begins by talking about servants. Be subject to your masters with all respect. This one's hard for us because the servants that were, and the slaves that were in this country were horribly abused by people who thought they were justified by doing it. But I think Peter's teaching here is especially important to people who are literally servants, literally slaves. And again, I'm going to mention that I think it's kind of odd that this follows right after saying to these people, live as free people. Servants. That's interesting, isn't it? How do slaves live as free people? How do slaves value their masters? I think Peter is using a particularly difficult situation to teach us that doing good, this is what it means to do good in the most difficult of circumstances that these people struggle with. Slaves don't have a lot of options, do they? They're very much at the mercy of their master. And please understand, as we look at this, I want us to be careful. We don't want to apply this to any kind of an abusive relationship. This is talking about, very literally, masters and slaves that existed at that time. And you'll notice that he talks about how they face, in verse 19, sorrows. They're suffering unjustly in verse 19, and that they suffer in verse 20. But Peter reminds them of how they need to think and treat their masters. Be subject to them, he says, with all respect. We'll get to that in a moment, but he prefaces that with all respect with not just to the good and the gentle, and there's a part of me that says, well, that's clearly hypothetical, but also to the unjust masters. Treat someone, your master, with all respect when he's not being just. Well, that's not right. Isn't that not your first thought? That's not right, that's not fair, that's not how things should be. What if my master mistreats me and beats me? Do I still have to treat him with all respect? Our tendency, my tendency, I'm pushing that on you. My tendency is to think I should stand up for my rights and I should oppose my master. Or I could even feel justified in running away because he's a bad master. I think all of those are thoughts that happen not just for me. Peter recognizes that if we're not respectful of our masters when they beat us, our reaction says nothing about who we are. 3 times he talks about enduring. Twice he speaks about it being a gracious thing in the eyes of God when we endure. When we endure when things are not as they should be, when we endure when things are very wrong, how do we do that? Understand, endure in this passage means to bear up under. It means kind of to get by. Although Vine puts the word courageously there, to bear up under courageously. So, doing it with a good attitude. But understand that enduring this, it doesn't mean that we approve of what's happening to us. It doesn't mean that we blame ourselves for what is happening to us, because he's talked about we're doing good during this time. Nor does it mean that we're complicit in this. Okay. But we are enduring. Treat them with respect, the just and the unjust. Be subject with all respect. No matter what they do, we can choose to respond respectfully. I imagine myself having a hard time with this because sometimes, even if I put up with someone treating me badly, I walk away with a very belligerent attitude, or I'm sarcastic and mocking. Even if my master never knows, there's that part of Dave that's mumbling under his breath. That's not all respect. We have to be so careful about that. He also tells them to do this being mindful of God. He keeps bringing us back to that, doesn't he? That this is not about them. It's about us, and it's about our relationship with God. Be mindful of God, because our tendency is to focus, if we're being misused or abused, we tend to think about the immediate distress, and that's understandable. So what would be included in being mindful of God in these cases where we endure suffering? My mind goes back to how Peter began the book when we talked about praising God, remembering that he has given us great mercy. We have this living hope kept in heaven for us. We are guarded by the power of God for salvation in the last time. Keep those things. Be mindful of God, even in those horrible moments. And we do good. We endure suffering. We still do good. Is it more difficult to do good when you're suffering? I think I'm more prone to excuse poor or rude behavior because I'm under duress. We're tired, we're overwhelmed. But finding little ways of doing good means a lot. My intention was to tell you a couple of stories about the Nazi concentration camps and how there were little points in there where the prisoners were helping the other prisoners survive. But then I just spent a week with Connie. And during this week with Connie, who is spending all of her time taking care of Sean, who is exhausted and physically struggling, we had the fire alarm go off one night and stayed on for 30 minutes. It's like 2:45 to 3:15. Connie's texting another handicapped woman to make sure she's okay. Connie's talking to neighbors in the hall and taking care of their cats while they're gone. She chased down a cat for a lady who couldn't keep up because she was in it. This is the idea of doing good when you're suffering. Connie's life now is really difficult. And yet, she's still Connie. Just a cup of cold water. Endure suffering. Do good while you're doing it. And he says, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God, twice. What does that mean? This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. This is not saying that we're being gracious, but that God shows his favor for us. He's gracious for us when we endure. And really, isn't that what we're looking for? That's what helps us endure the suffering is that while we're enduring the suffering and we're treating others with respect and we're doing good, that God looks at us and says, I see what you're going through. And he approves. He approves of our character, of the choices in these difficult situations. And next week we'll finish this lesson where we look at the example of Christ. Because I talk too much. This, though, is really a powerful follow-up to these 5 things that we've looked at, is looking at what Christ did for us and seeing the specific example of how he did all of these things. So that's what our lesson will be about next week. If you're here this morning, you're not a child of God, this is a great opportunity to become an elect, a chosen one of God. If you believe in him, you're ready to repent of your sins, you can be baptized, those sins can be washed away. If you're a brother or sister, if you need our help, please let us know as we sing.